Research by vet scientists at the University of Sydney is the first to show that restrictive nosebands and double bridles worn in training and competition can cause pain and suffering to horses. The RSPCA is calling for an urgent review of equestrian rules and a ban on crank nosebands. The National Reporting Team's James Thomas has this report for Lateline.
With good potential, maintain balance, 7.
In the end, we become as one, as close as that is possible between a person and a horse.
Becoming as one with 500 kilograms of horse is greatly assisted in equestrian sports with the use of the crank noseband. A leather strap which goes around the horse's jaw can be tightened by the rider using a system of pulleys. The tighter it is, the greater the contact between the animal's mouth and the metal bits of the bridle, resulting in control and precision in an exacting sport.
What we try to create is a partnership with our horses. Of course, we love them and we have great sympathy with them.
A common equestrian refrain is the horse enjoys competing as much as the rider.
I come in through those gates and he sort of pricks his ears and he goes, "Showtime!" And you know, he just loves it.
But now, some scientists are telling a different story. Researchers from the University of Sydney's Faculty of Veterinary Science have shown that the use of restrictive nosebands in conjunction with double bridles can bind together the jaws of horses, which can prevent blood flow, tongue movement and even swallowing.
Well, when the horse wears a double bridle, which is mandatory at the elite level, it's certainly in dressage, it's got 2 bits in its mouth. What we've discovered is that as you tighten the noseband, those bits are compressed against the tongue, and it appears that they immobilise the tongue.
Professor Paul McGreevy is the senior author on the study, published in the Public Library of Science.
This study looks at nosebands on horses at 4 different levels of tightness, from loose to very tight. And the very tight condition is, we think, applied in about 50% of competition horses.
Cranked too tight, the nosebands can also cause lacerations, ulcers, and a physiological stress response which could indicate pain and suffering.
It was really quite alarming for me when I started to look at the results that we got, to see just how high the heart rates went and the eye temperature went up as well. So everything told us that the horse was stressed physiologically.
Kate Fenner is a co-author of the study, which is sending shockwaves through the equestrian community in the lead-up to the Rio Olympics.
At the upcoming Olympics, of course, pretty much all the horses are going to be wearing these nosebands. All the dressage horses will be, for sure. So it is a big problem, and it's certainly something that needs to be looked at.
30 animal protection groups from around the world are now calling on the International Equestrian Federation to limit the tightening of these nosebands. Now, the way to do that is by using a device like this. It's just a measuring gauge, and they want it mandatory at all competitions. So before the competition, a steward or someone will try and slip it under the nose. If it doesn't get under, it's too tight.
This study has shown that horses are suffering a physiological stress response. That means that they are suffering pain during the time that they're wearing these restrictive nosebands. Horses shouldn't be made to suffer in the name of sport.
The RSPCA's chief scientist, Bidder Jones, goes a step further, calling for the ban of restrictive nosebands.
We would never let a human athlete compete wearing something like this. They would complain in an instant. Horses don't complain. They put up with all sorts of things. But what this study has done is shown that these nosebands cause horses suffering, and it's time they were no longer used.
And we certainly would not be opposing the opinions of the RSPCA and other organisations whose concern is for the welfare of the horse.
So you will ban the crank noseband then?
I said that we will investigate.
The chair of Equestrian Australia, Judy Fasher, says there is a testing regime in place at competitions.
at every competition where the horse is competing, they are inspected prior to the beginning of the performance. The gear is inspected to make sure that the gear actually fits the horse correctly.
So, of all those investigations and inspections that you do, how many nosebands are you aware of being loosened or being deemed too tight?
I'm afraid that's the statistics that's not readily to hand.
At an equestrian event visited by the ABC last week, horses were being inspected by stewards, but not always prior to performance.
We certainly don't see any evidence that crank nosebands are causing any serious injury to horses.
Equestrian Australia's veterinarian Dr. Nathan Anthony says he welcomes the University of Sydney study, but rejects aspects of its methodology.
A very small number of horses were actually tested and looked at, and the second is that these horses were unconditioned to the use of a double bridle and a noseband. They'd never had that on before. So as you'd expect that if these horses are likely to have a greater stress response just by virtue of the fact that this is new equipment.
The study's sample size is valid according to the authors of the research, and they say there is no evidence to suggest a horse suffers less when conditioned to the double bridle and crank noseband.
We have to have a long, hard look at ourselves. We have to work out what is fair to the horse, because it's a participant, but not necessarily a willing participant in these activities.
Professor McGreevy says the first step is for the International Equestrian Federation to implement horse inspections with the taper gauge.
And that tells you that there is space for two fingers. Well, the FEI have known about this problem for at least 4 years, and they've also had a solution at their fingertips, the so-called ISIS taper gauge.
But the Equestrian Federation of Australia rejects the use of the standardised measurement device.
Because every horse's profile of its face is entirely different. There's no such thing as there can't be a standardised test.
Ms Fasher says the organisation prefers to rely on the subjective judgment of stewards.
When the steward actually inspects the gear, he or she looks at it in relationship to that horse. Our stewards are experienced horse people that are horse aware, and they are trained to recognise when a horse is stressed.
However, an experienced steward told us that the gauge would be a positive development. Would you like to see the taper gauge so that you have a standardised test of tightness?
I think it's a possibility, yes. I think it would probably be a good idea.
Carolyn James was the chief steward at this equestrian event. She conceded that tight nosebands are an issue of concern for equestrian sports.
We haven't any other checks at the moment on that, but it is an issue, and we certainly check for it.
So it is a bit of an issue?
I think it has been perhaps in dressage. We haven't found it here in eventing.
The study has brought an uncomfortable focus on a sport trying to win public support. Equestrian Australia's Olympic campaign message is a story of committed partnership and mutual respect, forming an extraordinary connection of two hearts, the horse and rider, coming together as one. That message may risk being undermined by the use of restrictive nosebands.
Denying horses normal behaviours in the name of sport is quite difficult to defend ethically.
In this election,